welcome back to Behind the Cycle, third episode. And now we've got a discussion about the lay of the land as it pertains to promised cuts to the New Zealand public sector. And we'll broaden that out to a wider discussion about the government's economic agenda vis-a-vis the low paid and workers more generally, touching on the extremely parsimonious minimum wage decision as well. And to that effect, we have, I think, the best two guests you could find. Fleur Fitzsimons from the PSA, great to see you. Craig Renney's back after getting so many rapturous reviews from his first turnout. He'll be involved in this discussion as well. So Fleur, draw out a little bit, helicopter view, as they say. National's austerity agenda as it pertains to cuts to the public sector. How's it looking?
Yeah, look, it's really concerning what we're seeing, because what we saw during the election campaign was a National Party that came out quite strongly about cuts to the public sector, but it did reserve a number of departments from those cuts, including places like Oranga Tamariki and the Ministry of Education. But what you've seen since the coalition deals have been revealed is that those cuts are going to go even deeper than the National Party first said, which I think is a clear broken election promise. But putting that to one side, what we do know is that the ACT Party are having a big impact on the nature of the cuts. We know that David Seymour, in his role as Associate Finance Minister, is going to be overseeing with Nicola Willis the nature of the cuts. And their agenda is much, much deeper cuts. And he's even talked about, and it's in the coalition agreement, going back to 2017 headcount levels. Now, that fails to take into account the $500 million increase we've had in the population, but also the needs of New Zealand being so much more complex than they were in 2017. We've got an ageing population, we've got an infrastructure deficit, climate change is worse. So it's really concerning what we're going to see from this government, and we're just seeing it start to play out in various public service agencies at this time.
And can you give us a couple of examples of where, actually, before we get to that, if you're a public servant in Wellington at the moment, in let's say any given agency, how are you seeing this play out? Are you being brought into discussions about this? How are leaders within the public sector managing that with their staff?
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, is that government chief executives have been written to by Nicola Willis and told to cut either 6.5 or 7.5 from their departmental budgets. Now, those are significant cuts, but to be fair to the Minister of Finance, she did say in that letter to chief executives that they must involve their staff in the discussions, and that people who are working in those government agencies are best placed to identify where savings or efficiencies can be made. So the union, as the PSA, we've been engaging with our members because she's correct. Members are, and we've said this for many years, union members are best placed to identify efficiency. So we've been asking them, what can be done differently? What are the sorts of things that with more investment could actually save money in the long run? And sure enough, public servants have many, many ideas, including using office space more smartly, looking at the travel budgets, considering the nature of the way that IT systems operate, and many, many more things. So it's not that public servants are anti any change whatsoever. What they don't want to see is the kind of blunt cuts across the board that they know will impact on services. So it's a very anxious time for public servants. We don't know the extent to which the chief executives or the government will listen to the ideas that we've got and see sense and hopefully not use such a blunt instrument as a percentage figure just applied randomly across government agencies. And it's very dangerous.
Go ahead.
Even the Te Kaua Mataho, which is Public Service Commission, they have come out saying that the government should be very cautious about using such a blunt instrument as a particular percentage saving, because it doesn't allow the kind of nuance that you need to understand the pressures on, for example, the court systems or customs or the Department of Conservation and their role protecting the conservation estate. So in their briefing to the incoming minister, which was recently released, they said stay away from these kind of blunt tools, but so far the government's not listening.
So when you talk about There seems to be a bit of a Craig on your end, a little bit of background noise. If we could see if we can reduce that. Let's see if I can take it out in post production, as they say. That's done. That's done it. Thank you, Fleur. When you say, it's back, but anyway, we'll persist. The 7.5%, or I think you said 6.5 or 7.5, is that does that refer to operational or budgets overall, or headcount?
No, it does refer to operational budgets overall. So there is the potential to find savings that don't impact on jobs. And that's what the union has been talking to members about and talking to employers about, is trying to find ways to make savings or address some things that workers see as inefficiencies operating in their workplaces, that we can start to reduce expenditure. Because, as I say, people are not just completely closed to the idea that we need to do things differently, and workers are well placed to find them. And we've come up with, members have come up with some excellent ideas from which savings can be made. But the reality is 6.5 or 7.5 is a huge amount off these budgets. And these were not workplaces and organisations that were operating in a lavish way. They already have gone through this process under the former government and even before this. So it's not like there's a whole lot of fat that's available to cut. And this whole idea that the government has that they can cut back office jobs, it's just so unrealistic. The back office, so-called back office roles, are those that are supporting social workers or customs officers or biosecurity officers, protecting New Zealand's children or protecting our borders or protecting our agriculture industry. So it's a false distinction to say that there's these back office roles that don't have any impact on the front line. It simply isn't the case.
Yeah, it seems to be reflecting on a sort of, I'm dating myself here, but a gliding on concept of the public. I don't even know if it was true at the time, but this notion that there's all these ne'er-do-well public servants twiddling their thumbs and taking home their paycheck, which does not in any way relate to my knowledge of anyone working in the public service. Certainly not over the last few years, where, as you say, the exigencies that you've been having to deal with it in all these agencies, without exception, probably, in terms of the impacts, say, of COVID, have made it a very hard-working public sector, and not a large one by international standards, by any means.
No,
Craig, would you agree? So just in throwing to Craig, are they talking about CPI adjusted figures, or are they talking about 6.5 or 7.5 off budgets that were set, 12 months ago, before several percent was added by way of inflation?
You're absolutely right. It's 6 or 7% off the last year's budget. CPI will have changed since then, but also, as Fleur quite rightly said, every year, even without inflation, we have greater needs because of population change. We have greater needs because our demographics, we have an older population. That means more service. And where we have services, special educational needs is a great example, we have greater density of need. So we have more children who need special educational needs, and their needs are greater each year. What that means is that the costs go up, even if inflation doesn't go up. And so we end up, if we cut, it's not just the direct cut to the service, it's the direct cut to the service plus not meeting population needs, plus not meeting service needs, which means that we pay for that in the long run. Because if we're not paying for it up front, we're paying for it as a consequence of additional welfare payments, additional housing costs, additional loss of productivity. So there's a cost which is borne by the New Zealand public as a direct consequence of trying to make a saving from a public service today.
Right. Fleur, I interrupted you before. What were you about to say?
No, I was actually just going to bring in Craig on a point around that I think hasn't kind of got enough attention during this whole debate, which is the link between the ideological position of this government and what they're doing to cuts. Because actually what we know is that the political right want small government, they're sceptical of government services, and we also know that they favour the role of the market, which is actually, of course, just code for capitalists being able to do things their own way. But what I'm interested in is the contrast with John Key when he was in government. He spoke at the PSA Congress back in 2008, and his language was much more conciliatory than we're seeing from Chris Luxon. He talked about a cap, not a cut. Now, the cap didn't work, and it wasn't a great political or tool for quality public services. But what it does show is the massive change in the ideological shift within the National Party, and even you're seeing it with New Zealand First. They've agreed to the change to the Reserve Bank Act, and so what you're seeing, I think, is a return to the kind of right-wing policies that we saw in the 80s, which actually Key wouldn't even be associated with. And I know, Craig, that you've lived through some of that in the United Kingdom, and it feels like New Zealand's coming back and being more aligned ideologically with what we saw in the 80s, rather than what we saw from the more modern National Party under John Key's leadership. And I think that ideological point, Craig, I know you've got a lot of experience with that in the UK too.
It's the reason I'm in New Zealand. Is the changes under David Cameron, which was that forced austerity agenda, deliberately trying, as you say, to slim the role of government, slim the role of the state, make it a much more passive participant in New Zealand society, and using that space to then try and deliver tax cuts and service cuts, which benefit higher income groups and benefit private businesses who then can deliver the same goods or services that were previously being delivered by the state. And certainly there seems to be much more of a tone in these sets of changes of a loss of faith in the power of government to do good. Previously, even under Bill English's approach to the social investment approach was to say, how do we make savings that through the public service, where we're still delivering public services, but we're doing so in a more efficient way. This is just how do we reduce public services? And
I think that there's a very large distinction between reforms or realignment of services designed to improve the efficiency of public services from the point of view of the citizen versus making austerity-driven, ideologically driven cuts that serve the ideological interests of the government and that part of the population that benefits from the income tax cuts that ultimately these are all about funding, right? I mean, it's like, we're not saying on the left, I don't believe, that there's no room for efficiencies. When we talk about efficiencies for whom? And efficiencies for whom, why? And that is the discussion I think where we're on very strong ground, because as you say, Fleur, if we take into account CPI, population growth, and across the board blunt tool 6.5, 7.5 cut, you're not talking about efficiencies anymore. You're talking about an ideological retooling of the public sector. And that is not something that they took to the election.
That work, we could even still have that conversation sensibly if we were using all of those savings to then say, well, how do we make the public sector better? If we're using that money to put into health, into education, into housing, into a range of other areas, and saying we know we have problems, let's use these back office efficiencies, which is the wrong term, but let's use these efficiencies to then say how we then deliver those resources into areas we really need them. We're not doing that. We're putting $2.5 billion into the pockets of landlords. We're putting billions of dollars into the pockets of those with very high incomes in the form of a tax cut. These savings aren't savings to help save the public service. These are savings to help put money into the pockets of those who've already done really well over the past couple of decades. If we look at where the tax cut goes for a minimum wage worker, prior to the tax changes, prior to the changes announced, would be on somewhere in the order of $2 a week in terms of the tax benefit. That's not something they're going to be, that's not going to save them in terms of the cost of living, but for landlords, it's going to put thousands of dollars in their pockets in the forms of tax changes. Now, do I believe that taking money out of the Ministry of Education or the department that looks after family violence and sexual violence is the right approach to put then that money in the pockets of landlords. No, there's a much better way of doing it, and there's a much better conversation we could be having about where, what is the role of the state and what we should be doing. And as Fleur quite rightly pointed out, that's because this is not something to do with public sector efficiency. This is something to do with ideology and shrinking the role of the state back down to some theoretical notion which is sensible. It's never been sensible in New Zealand. New Zealand underinvests in its public service in comparison to other countries, and we get the services as a consequence of that level of underinvestment.
Fleur, are ministers instructing departmental chief executives to reduce what each agency actually does? Or are they simply saying, no, keep doing what you're doing, maybe even do a few extra things that are of interest to the government?
I think that's a very important point. So one of the things that we've been very strong on as a union, and let's see how successful we can be with this, but when and if people are made redundant, if we do lose public service workers, which obviously we're going to oppose and we're trying to stop, and we're still hopeful that we might have some success there. But if that doesn't happen, it's absolutely critical that the people who are left don't pick up the workloads of those who are no longer working there. And that's one of the big pieces of work that we need to do to understand that, because our experience when there are job losses is that the workloads of the people left go up and become even less manageable and become a health and safety issue. So to some degree, there are some areas, if you look at things like Let's Get Wellington Moving and Waka Kotahi and the end of that, or the end of the regional leadership skills groups, or the fair pay agreements, in some ways those have, those are clear. There is no work, that work will no longer continue. And obviously I disagree with that, but it is a very clear line in terms of that work doesn't carry on. What we need to be vigilant about is making sure if these cuts occur and where they happen, is that the workload isn't just picked up by those left, because that will become a major issue in those departments. And we also need to be really clear that we need to keep rewarding and valuing public servants. So we're currently in bargaining with the Ministry for Business, Innovation and Employment for a collective agreement covering thousands of workers there. We are clear that those workers continue to need a pay increase, and we'll continue to be advocating for that. We're not going to put aside issues like equal pay because of the context and the change of government. Those issues are as important now as they were in the past.
Yeah, that's right. Absolutely. Craig, what was your reaction to the minimum wage announcement? What did you think when you saw it?
The honest answer is I thought it was a typo when I saw it first. I thought, that's silly, that's a typo. That's clearly someone's just put the wrong number in the press release. 2% means that for thousands of some of the hardest working yet lowest paid workers right across this country, they'll be seeing a real terms wage cut. Inflation's currently 4.7%. That means that's approximately, if the difference between that and 2% is $1,200 a year, directly out of the pockets of low-paid workers each. If your plan is to get the economy back on track and to help, reduce government spending, and you're going to do that on the shoulders of some of those lowest-paid workers across New Zealand, get a better plan. Right now, we're asking those people to take a pay cut to save some businesses in the interests of balance. Essentially, we're saying they have to pay the costs of inflation and those businesses don't. That's not only a poor moral place, it's terrible economics for the country. These people minimum wage workers aren't largely saving their income, they're spending it. These are people who need every dollar that they can get. That's money that's then lost to local communities right around the country. From Kaitaia to Bluff, that's incomes not going back into local communities. Secondly, when those households don't get that income from the minimum wage, they get support from the tax credit system. They get support from accommodation supplement. They get support from the welfare state. So the Crown pays on the other side. Anywhere else in economics, we would call that a subsidy. And so that looks like a subsidy to some of the lowest paid employers in the country. So
yeah,
it makes no sense from an economic perspective. It makes no sense from a fiscal perspective, and certainly from a moral or a political perspective, it seems to make it's very questionable indeed.
In the same way as they reintroduced the 90-day rule in a labour market like this one, right?
Mm.
And add to that the minimum wage decision, it's starting to feel punitive, ideologically punitive. It's about, we hear a lot about picking winners and losers. It feels to me like they're picking losers here. They're saying, because we can add to that list, tell me if I'm wrong, that people on job seeker allowance or on some other form of benefit, that's now tied to, under their rules, to CPI rather than to wages, which at a time where wage growth is actually outstripping CPI quite comfortably, that's another, it seems to me, gratuitous, punitive act of ideological bastardry. And I can't see any public policy rationale for it, and I don't even hear them offering one.
There's a during the coalition negotiations, Henry Cook, the journalist, said that this was likely to be a government that had a war on woke, and that it really didn't like woke issues. What we've seen via welfare changes, loss of fair pay agreements, 90-day trials, welfare changes to CPI. This is not a war on woke. This is a war on the broke. This is a war on people who don't have incomes.
Mm.
This is a war on people who are doing it really tough, and they're the ones having to bear the costs of that. Now think about this. This is a below inflation minimum wage increase, which is much less than the VAT, which means they will lose much more than the value of any tax cut they will get on the other side.
Oh, yeah.
And that's before they now have to pay for prescription fees. That's before public transport prices went up. That's before a rate. You can see at each point in time where this government has chosen to put the financial pain is not on those who've done well. It's not on those who have higher incomes. They've chosen to put the financial pain on those with no choices, and with very low incomes. And again, it not only makes poor
and no savings.
It not only makes poor fiscal sense, it not only makes poor policy sense, because these are people who inevitably will end up coming and costing the crown somewhere else. It makes no economic sense, because if you have to put a dollar somewhere, put a dollar on to support those who will spend that income and need it desperately. Don't give a dollar to those who already have lots of them, because they'll either put it in the bank, great, or they'll buy something from overseas, and that money just disappears overseas.
And I think it's important to note, and Fleur, I would like your response to all of that. But I just want to say the war on woke is all about distracting you from the war on the broke.
Mm.
Let's be clear about that. They're not in the business they're in for these culture war sideshows. The culture war sideshows allow them to do what they really want to do, because they know that the number of people who wake up on election day and think, I'm going to find the party that wants to rip as much income out of my household, give as much tax relief to landlords as they can possibly imagine. That there's no constituency for that. The war on woke is quite a strategic, intentional, and frankly quite cliched effort at distraction, bait and switch.
Yeah, 100%. No, absolutely. And I think that analysis is being on. It's also just cruel. It comes from a heartless position of not even seeing these people as human beings that need to have dignity. And if you look at the 90-day trials, what it says to any person to lose their job and not even know why, and the dynamic that sets up between an employer and a worker, is just horrific. And
it's often their first job, isn't it, Fleur? It's often their first job.
Yes, it's often I represented some young workers who were dismissed under the 90-day trials last time National were in government. farm workers, cafe workers, and they were absolutely destroyed. They'd bring their parents to the discussions with the employer when we were trying to fix it up and settle these things. These people felt personally absolutely devastated and emotionally broke down by these dismissals when they had absolutely no idea what they'd done wrong, or they'd made a silly mistake weeks ago, or the employer was simply taking advantage of the ability to move them on and get someone else in. So that's why I say it's cruel. It's a cruel ideology. And what we know is that women, Māori, Pacifica, poor people, rainbow communities, groups that are marginalised already will be further disadvantaged by the nature of the cuts to the public service, the failure to increase the minimum wage, and 90-day trials. So it's very dangerous in terms of the type of society that we're creating in New Zealand. And I think that's part of how we need to build our resistance to this government, is that we need to make sure that we're building alliances across all of those groups, because they are really paying the price for this government's cruel ideological agenda.
And are you seeing resistance efforts along those lines come together?
Well, I think the most incredible resistance is being seen through the organising of Māori.
Yeah.
What we saw at Ratana, what we saw at Waitangi, and the beautiful alliance that's breeding between Māori and non-Māori in this country, I think is what we're seeing is just the beginning of what we're going to see. And it does need to widen. We do need to expose this as an ideological choice. And Craig's very good at setting this up as a choice between two different opposing New Zealands. What kind of New Zealand do we want to live in? Do we want to live in this one which is cruel, which attacks marginalised communities, which makes people's lives worse, which gives people no dignity in their work and doesn't take a humane approach to people's lives and how they live? Or do we want to live in New Zealand that's the opposite? Because it is a choice. And Craig is very good at pointing out that stark choice that we have as a nation.
Oh, absolutely. Craig, lay it out for us. Where are you thinking now? Are they further to the shock doctrine sort of 90s era, as Fleur pointed out earlier, government than you expected them to be? Are you shocked by the degree of ideological drive that they're demonstrating?
I think what should worry us is that during the initial period after the election campaign, they've turned everything upside down. And being prepared to go back on many of the commitments they made during the election campaign in order to continue to deliver their tax changes. And that gives you some sense of where their moral compass is pointing. So they're going to deliver those tax changes regardless of the impact that it's going to have on communities, on particular groups, on low-income groups right across New Zealand. What should terrify New Zealanders is what's next, because it's not in the coalition agreements and where they're likely to go after that. So we can already see inside the coalition agreements, they talk about introducing time limits for those on welfare. That's in the New Zealand First National Coalition Agreement. They talk about further changing industrial law so that if you ever become a contractor, you're permanently a contractor without the right ever to become an employee. That means that would casualize giant sectors of the workforce, which would mean your annual leave would go, your maternity leave would go, your ACC payments would become your problem rather than your employer's, so on, and so forth. You can see the direction inside the coalition documents where they want to go. What should terrify us is they haven't been clear about what good looks like for them. And I think that's even further to a more market-oriented, hyper-liberalized, hyper-individualized economy than the one we have in New Zealand. And if we point to the kinds of examples of successful economies that we as New Zealanders often look like and want to aspire to, they're in the opposite direction. They're economies that have much stronger welfare states. They're economies that have much stronger public services. They're economies where inequality is far lower and far less stark than it is in New Zealand. There's certainly countries that have far lower rates of child poverty than New Zealand. And so we're heading in the wrong direction right now. And the challenge we have is that in the future, they're not going to turn that ship around. we're going to keep heading in that direction unless we force that ship to stop. And that speaks to Fleur's point about needing to build those coalitions together to help force that change on this government, because it's not going to do it without that change being forced upon them.
One last question, because you've been very generous with your time, both of you, but Fleur, not all public servants work in Wellington-based agencies with a lot of colleagues around them. Some of them work in far more isolated settings in smaller towns, and they'll be anxious, won't they? What is the union doing particularly with workers in that category, to ensure that they're kept informed, they know what their rights are, and more broadly, I guess, to finish it off, what's the campaign look like in the coming months, and what can listeners to this podcast and others do to help?
Well, the best thing you can do is make sure that you join your union wherever you are, wherever you work. But yes, the PSA will be defending every job. We won't be accepting any cut. And we've been really clear with the government that we oppose their changes, that we think further investment is needed in public services, not arbitrary cuts. And we're also talking to our members about what ways they could contribute to doing work differently. So we've already had conversations with thousands of members throughout the public service about how work could be done differently, because we're not just accepting these cuts, we're taking them as an opportunity to engage with our members and promote better public services. And they have many, many ideas about how to do that. And at the moment, we've written letters to chief executives outlining the ideas of our members. And we're really hopeful that they'll be taken seriously. They don't include job losses. They include different ways of doing work and more efficient ways of organising. So we're really optimistic that CEOs will listen, and hopeful that we won't be seeing the kind of change proposals that involve lots of public servants' jobs being lost, because that is not the way to go. And it's going to have an impact on New Zealand for years to come if we see that. And you're right, it's not just Wellington. Public servants are employed all over New Zealand, including on tiny wee islands. You'll have dock staff working and important people doing work on our borders and even overseas. So yeah, it's absolutely critical that people join the union, get involved, and make sure their voice is heard, because this is a campaign that is starting to ramp up right now.
Brilliant. And I, for one, am glad that you're one of the people at the lead of that campaign, because I know you do a great job. Craig, awesome as always. Look forward to talking next time. And we'll be back talking about what kind of leader Luxon is turning out to be, from our leadership expert, former Napier candidate and clinical psychologist, could come in handy, Mark Hutchinson. See you later. And welcome back to Behind the Cycle. We have a very special co-host, Mark Hutchinson, with us now. Mark, you may recognise from the recent campaign, he was Labor's relatively late recruit to run in Napier at the most recent election. But his day job, and he'll talk to us at length about this, is as a consultant to business and other organisational leaders, drawing on his expertise as a trained clinical psychologist. Mark, kia ora and welcome.
Nice to be here. Thanks, Phil. Thanks for bringing me on board today.
Oh, you're more than welcome, and look forward to having you back many, many times. Mark, to begin this conversation, which will be about leadership, which is your area of expertise, or one of them, and I think to set the scene, I'm going to risk triggering some post-traumatic stress disorder in you by playing a short video clip that you may remember, and in fact you feature in, although not audibly. You're in the video, but you're not heard in the video, which is your National Party opponent talking about what makes this National Party different from others. So let's just play that video and we'll discuss it on the other side.
State better than Labor, but they didn't really make any transformational changes. What's going to change?
So do you know what I'm going to say? Chris Luxon is what makes a difference. He is an outcomes-focused. He is an outcomes-focused, prioritising businessman. I tell you now, honestly, if you listen to the things that he is talking about, he is relentless on outcomes. He is relentless on outcomes.
So, Mark,
Yes.
relentless on outcomes, outcomes-focused prioritizer.
It sounds like
you're-
describing a sort of a regional sales leader in an FMCG company trying to increase the sales of Dove soap.
Funny that.
Mm.
But on a slightly more serious note, it is a certain kind of leadership model that he seems to lean into, that I think we could have sort of inferred from his time as opposition leader and his career beforehand. But we've now had a few months to assess. We've had his first Waitangi Day. What do you think we can say? And I'm not asking for any kind of psychoanalysis here, just in general terms, just reflect on his leadership style and what your experience with other corporate leaders tells you about perhaps what we can expect from it.
Yeah, I think and obviously I haven't worked with him closely. I've worked with lots of different CEOs across a range of different industries, but I suppose what I'd say to you is if I'd met him 10 years ago and he'd come and lain on my couch and bared his career in front of me, I would have said, Christopher, it's a bit narrow. You need to broaden out, because FMCG is a great place to get the grounding and it's a great place to be a senior leader. But if you only spend your life in one industry, particularly if it is a very narrow kind of industry, it's going to shape your leadership style in a particular kind of way. And as you know, if fast-moving consumer goods, selling deodorants and things, it's very much can we squeeze a couple of cents out of the cost of a bar of soap, and can we sell it for a bit more by glossing up the marketing brand? And then we have teams of people with sales targets, and we do relentlessly drive to sell a little bit more of it everywhere, every year. And so that's a very, they're complex businesses, of course, but it's a very simple strategic business model. And it doesn't rely a lot on, interdependencies. So the difference between that and, being a CEO of a broader company or being a prime minister in particular is the narrowness versus breadth. And I think it's pretty clear that he was successful at Unilever. I think in the aviation sector, the jury might be out on how successful he was in terms of the impact he left in Air New Zealand.
And if you're running as you say, a fast-moving consumer business, selling deodorant, if you're selling airline tickets, you've got high visibility on the world that you're able to influence through your decision making and through your leadership. That seems starkly at odds to what the reality of political leadership is, where it really is, for all that you can have an agenda, for all that you can come in with a grand plan, fundamentally it's dealing with exigencies. It's dealing with things that you have no visibility or little visibility on, and you never saw coming, and you need to adapt and move with rapidly changing circumstances over which you have next to no control. That strikes me as something that where I think we're already seeing evidence of that in some of his decisions.
So working in a big corporate, of the likes of Unilever, it's a huge process-oriented machine. And there are ways of grinding a bit more margin out here and grinding a bit more sales out. And year on year, you do relentlessly go to grind out a 2% sales growth for North America and a 1% margin improvement in Africa or whatever. And you just grind a little bit more out of the machine every year. But if we were to go through some areas that, good leaders have, and then you could kind of throw back to me kind of what your thinking is around that. I mean, there are some things that because you can be a CEO or a really good CEO or a really bad CEO, right? And the thing that I've observed over 20 years that the really good ones have, and there's depth under each of these areas, but they have empathy, they have humility and vulnerability, they have acumen, or what some people would call judgment, and that's not just intellect, by the way, that's other stuff. And they have a courage and a deep inner confidence, and that's the opposite of ego.
Right.
And so, if you look at as a starting point, if you look at empathy, that's the ability to tune into others and context, right?
Yeah.
So it's slightly less important when your target is just to have a 2% increase in sales of soap or underarm deodorant, but it's really critical. And I watched your recent Waitangi special. And if you think about that context, somebody with really good empathy, what it gives them is the ability to tune into others and the context as it's emerging and adapts to it. So what you see with leaders with good empathy is good listening, a genuine interest in other people and where they're coming from. What you do not see is cut and paste, because that suggests an inflexibility and a lack of empathy to the fact that the context is evolving, right? So what you find with people with empathy is that people with an ego, a need to be special or a need to be successful or a need to, and it happens in politicians as well as CEOs, right? They can come across as having a bit of a tin ear. And the reason is because they're focused on themselves, not the context. They're focused on how well am I doing here? How well am I being perceived? Am I being respected, adored, revered, seen as a successful businessman, politician, whatever? And I think the next thing is, and it's spoken a lot about, but it's humility and vulnerability, right? So the very best leaders that I've worked with have been able to develop amazing teams because they accept and understand that they have strengths and weaknesses, and so do other people. And by being able to be open and vulnerable about the fact, well, I'm not good at everything and I don't have the answers to everything, they create teams that are therefore able to work as a whole, where different people have different strengths. The opposite of that is, a leader that's always right, always defensive, very glossy on the surface. And when they get asked, why is this coalition negotiation taking so long? They say, it's not. We're doing a fantastic job.
Yeah.
Whereas the leader with humility and vulnerability, like I think a John Key would have said, it's tricky. It's taking longer than we wanted to. And, we're not happy with progress and we just need to do better.
Is in organizations where the leadership is fixedly, relentlessly, obsessively goal-oriented, metrics, get the outcome you want, as Katie Nimmin said, relentless on outcomes. What are some of the things that can fall by the wayside? What are some of the risks to the organization of that kind of approach?
I think some of the main ones are the ones that I mentioned before, that I in this country, we're still benefiting from dams that were built 100 years ago. And like if somebody's got that corporate mentality of facing up to the relentless results have to be, churning in every month, every day, every year. And with a sales background, there's almost even a daily and a weekly kind of check on how the numbers are running. You miss the fact that, in much less than 100 years' time, when Wellington Harbour rises by a metre, we're not going to have a ferry terminal, right? So because you're relentlessly focused on the fact that, in order to make your tax plan add up, you need to not spend that $1 billion, but it makes you less likely to be able to kind of step back and appreciate that there's a longer horizon.
Yeah, you've got the dual problem of sort of bloody-minded pursuit of certain metrics, but the other one is short-termism, right? So you're looking for quick wins. You're looking for where in industries that he's come from, I would guess the idea of long-term would be quarterly, right? That would be as close to long-term as you get. And we are living through with the water crisis in Wellington, but it's beyond just Wellington. It's right throughout the country. We are living through the consequences of exactly that kind of short-term mentality. And it's interesting, isn't it, that he has shown. We spoke yesterday with Craig Renney and Fleur Fitzsimons about the public sector cuts, and you're seeing that kind of Unilever, get your 2%, in the case of the public sector, 6.5%, 7.5%. Cut, notwithstanding CPI, notwithstanding population pressures, notwithstanding demands demands for the services. But here's a metric he can understand. Here's a metric he can stand behind. And I likewise see it, by the way, with his discussion around school attendance. He's latched on to a very low attendance figure that obviously related to the pandemic and its aftermath, and he's clearly seen that that's a metric he can get some improvement on in a very short in a relatively short time frame. So I get the feeling that we're going to see a lot of that.
That brings me nicely to the next area, which is what I call acumen or judgment. Yeah. And like, if you think about that as more than just intellect, because you could have a laser focused and narrow intellect, which is focused on, relentless targets and growth or whatever. But if you've got the sort of acumen that good CEOs, and I would argue absolutely critical in prime ministers, then you're good at scanning the environment and spotting what's important and what's not important. And that's a lateral, not narrow focus. And it's spotting for interconnectedness and joining the dots.
Right.
And you've got to, if, as a good leader, you've got to be able to sort of then predict beyond the data, because relentless focus on results is about data and making data better. But actually what's happening in the future is not in the data. COVID wasn't in the data. The GFC wasn't quite in the data, or somebody might have called it a bit soon. So you've got to scan the environment. That enables you to prioritize and focus your attention, then develop solutions. Now, a much easier way, you might even say intellectually lazy way to approach things, is to attack ideas. So, you know, I was lazy in the debating team, so I always went number 3, and like the job is quite fun. You just attack everybody else's ideas like Skittles, right? And so I see he has a certain skill in doing that. But the really difficult thing to do, and sometimes I see leaders, I help them transition into the CEO suite, and it's not until they're there that they realize, oh, it's very easy to criticize upwards all the time. But when you actually have to do it and come up with an idea and a plan, so joining the dots, seeing how things interconnect, seeing how one thing that you affect over here might affect something else over here. So in the absence of great judgment, great judgment, so scan the environment, prioritize your focus, work out what solutions are going to work and where are we heading, and labels you to create a compelling vision. And that's what I'm not seeing. What's the compelling vision? Because if I was to read the dots, if I was to join the dots and see the changes, so the priority is, you know, the ability for landlords to buy pre-existing properties and offset their interest. Well, every economist I've spoken to said that the New Zealand economy is already a property market with an economy tackled on, and that the last thing you want to do, you know, because the settings that Grant Robertson already had encouraged investors to build new properties, and if they wanted interest deductibility, they needed to increase the supply, which is supposed to be nationals. So what I'm saying is I'm not seeing the judgment which enables him to because you've got to have the good judgment and the good acumen to be able to articulate the compelling vision that people want to follow. So I understand a whole bunch of stuff they want to stop and they don't believe in, but I'm left saying, well, I'm not sure if they've thought it through, but where all this stuff adds up to is a country where a tiny percentage of people own most of the properties and everybody else gets paid stuff all to pour their lattes. But in the absence of him articulating where what they're doing is going, we're all having to join the dots and say, well, where is this taking the country? Because there's no articulation of a vision. And I think the other one that I said before that I think that most successful, you know, all really successful leaders have is a courage or a deep inner confidence, which is underpinned by a sense of purpose rather than underpinned by ego needs. So you either get purposeful leaders or ego-driven leaders, right? And ego-driven leaders are kind of, look at me, I'm great. You know, trust me, put your faith in me. I know where I'm going. I'm going to, you know, be the best person to run this country or best person to run this organization. And you do get a lot of that with people wanting to be CEOs as well. But the ones that are really excellent are the ones that go, we can transform this business by becoming this for our customers, or by doing this thing. You know, I work with some senior leaders in the renewable energy sector, and they're absolutely committed to, you know, renewable energy. And so they've got a real vision about how do you accelerate that? How do you make it easier for customers to adopt it and all of that sort of thing? And so the problem is that, and, you know, you can maybe comment on what you see with Mr. Luxon, but if the purpose is clear, which it would be, and it would align to that vision, right? If you had the nous to create a vision, you would see someone that had the courage of their convictions. So they would either believe that you needed a treaty principles bill, or they would not. And they would be able to articulate really clearly why this was a good or not a good idea. But what you get with the more ego-driven leader also is wanting to be adored and loved and everybody to like you. And so they're the kinds of leaders that speak with a slightly different tongue to a different audience. So I am sure that the conversation that Mr. Seymour had in private in the coalition talks will be different to what eventually, in some kind of backflipping capitulation we saw a couple of days ago, a very flustered looking Mr. Luxon saying, oh, no, we wouldn't do that. No, we're not going to support that. You know, because actually when he was faced with the fire and fury of people really deeply disagreeing. And so
I think that's an extremely astute point. In fact, I get this feeling that he is never quite owning up to what he actually believes on a lot of stuff. He's half leaning into what he knows are effective populist kind of arguments around things, but he doesn't quite have the courage of his convictions to carry it through. So he's left sort of stuck between two stools. And the Waitangi Principles Bill is a classic example where he's tapping into that minority, the fury on the right about over the treaty, but he's withdrawing before they get any satisfaction from him. So people like you and me think this whole process is a sham. It's built on a fallacious misinterpretation of what the treaty actually is and what it says. The whole thing should never take place and see the light of day or waste Parliament's time. We're certainly not happy with how Luxon's managing it. But, I don't think the racists out there are going to be particularly happy with this sort of half in, half out approach either. It seems to me that this desire he has, as you say, to sort of pander to any given audience and slightly modulate his rhetoric leaves him in the kind of political cul-de-sacs that is beyond anything he would have had to, deal with in the corporate world, because it is the range and diversity of stakeholders, the competing imperatives. It's not just that they're a great deal more numerous. You don't even know what they are half the time, or they're emerging and arising without any prior notice. And I think that's where he's struggling as a leader.
I think the core of that is that empathy bit, because you speak to people that have had conversations with him, they will say that he's better at talking than listening. And if you're a more ego-driven, ambitious person to get to the top of the tree, your drive to be seen to be the one that has something to say or can impact on the situation.
That's the difference, isn't it? That's the distinction between empathy, as you describe it, and pandering, right?
Yeah.
Pandering is about the speaker. Pandering is about making me, the speaker, look good by pandering to you, by appearing to demonstrate empathy. Empathy is about the listener, right?
Yeah.
It's about the other. And I think we're starting to see some cracks there again, because.
But again, without that, you can't be nimble. You can't, because you asked me a question the other day about the difference between CEOs and prime ministers, and one of the critical differences, of course, is that the CEO works in a more measurable. Yes, things happen that you have to react to, but the strategy process happens over a year with the board, and then you set your strategy, and then you relentlessly move towards the strategy. Things do happen, and you do have to respond operationally, like COVID or whatever. But that doesn't change the strategy. Whereas when you're in government, stuff happens day to day, which you have to react to nimbly. You can't sort of say, right, well, we're going to prepare a paper for the board and take that up to the board and get their view, and then come back, and then blah blah blah. That process kind of doesn't happen. You're there, and the media is pointing a camera in your face. And coming back to that bit about, well, if you've started out with the empathy for others, you're going to know what's happening around me, which humans and which contextual things are shifting around me that I need to respond to. If you've got the humility and vulnerability to know, well, what am I good at and what am I not good at, then you know who to get advice from. And there'll be times you could be in a room talking to somebody who you should actually be listening to and asking questions, because they could actually inform you. So the best leaders that I work with often say the less words at a meeting, because they're really just taking the tune of what's going on. And then when they speak, they're more likely to say something profound that ties it all together, and then reminds everybody how that links back to the vision or the purpose, or the range of other things that are different in the, if you were doing your transition coach from CEO to PM, and like I've already raised some questions about, we're assuming successful CE, and I'm not actually sure.
You're not accepting that premise.
But assuming successful CE moving to PM, there's the obvious thing about narrow to broad, Then
Yep.
there's the thing about, right, well, I'm in this job as a chief executive. If I don't like the team, I just sack them and get new ones from the outside if necessary. If I find myself with a team that doesn't have a digital expert or doesn't have a marketing expert,
Yeah.
and I've helped organizations find the right people to do those things, right? But in politics, you've actually got to mold and shape the team you have, at least until the next election. And even then, you know, your nemesis may have an electorate where they keep getting voted back in. So you've got to do a lot more coalition building even within your party than you do, because when you're a CEO, you're a benign dictator. Yes, you're answerable to a board.
Yeah.
But once you've aligned the strategy with the board, they pretty much, a good board will let you get on with operationally running the business. And if you come back to them to the next board meeting and say, oh, I've had to remove one of my team members because they didn't hit the relentless focus on targets for this month, then the board will let you do it. And his natural inclination to be able to do that. And also the other thing is performance management is quite different in business, right? So I just look at you and say, Phil, if you can hit this target, you get $1 million extra this year.
Mm.
And so in politics, all you have to offer is patronage, and you can give someone a minister's job or take it away. But there's not really any other, apart from your interpersonal skills and strengths and your coaching ability and your ability to influence as a human, you don't have those hard levers that you have in a corporate. I think finally, and we'll need to stop now, is the thing about direct control of execution. You know, if you're CEO, you have much more direct control over execution, whereas in politics, there's this public service independence, which all governments struggle with. And I think that's a real nut to crack, right? And people that come in with no experience, really, very minimal experience of, you know, you've become the Prime Minister when you've been a backbench MP for 3 years. There's a much more nuanced approach to influence required to get things to happen in the public sector, because you're actually legally not allowed to do the kinds of things that you're allowed to do as a CEO.
That we'll need to revisit all of it. But I think you've given a fantastic overview how being a CEO doesn't necessarily transfer immediately across the ninth floor. So let's talk about it more. And thank you very much for your time today, Mark.
No.